Hello. Thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. Once upon a time, which is a great way to start a story, I guess, but once upon a time, there were two women who were destitute. These women had no standing in their culture, no political pull. They were poor and desperate. Because of their hopeless situation, they were forced to turn to prostitution in order to survive. Now, this is not the life they had envisioned as young girls growing up in their parents' home, but it seems their dreams had died long ago. These two women are living in the same home, and they had both become pregnant around the same time, possibly a consequence of their occupation. The first lady had given birth to a son, and 3 days later, the second lady also gave birth to a son. I'm sure these women had conversations and thoughts that these two boys would grow up and be a blessing to their mothers. Maybe for the first time in a long time, these two women began to have glimmers of hope in their life. But in the middle of the night, there is more tragedy because one of the women rolled over and smothered her son. When she woke up and she discovered that her son had died, in her distress, she switched her dead child with the living child of the other woman. Now, a few hours later, these women are brought in front of the king because they needed someone to help them find justice. Both of these women are making the claim that the living child is theirs. And there was nobody to witness what happened. There was no DNA testing. Nobody knew who was telling the truth. So they find themselves standing in front of the king. Two women with no station, no political power, no position find themselves at the mercy of a king that they don't know. And when the king delivers his judgment, everybody in the room must have gasped. The king says, "Bring a sword and cut the baby boy in two and give each woman half of the child." This was a wise king, though. Because when the women reacted to the verdict, the king understood all that he needed to know. The first woman begged for the life of the child, even if it meant that her rival was allowed to keep the baby. The other woman, the second woman, agreed with the verdict. She said it was fair. At that moment, the king spoke. "Give the living baby to the first woman because no one's going to kill this baby. She's the real mother." Maybe you've heard the story before. Maybe you know that the king in the story was Solomon, and the story's told in 1 Kings chapter 3. And maybe you know that we're told the word got around, everyone in Israel heard of the king's judgment, they were all in awe of the king, realizing that it was God's wisdom that enabled him to judge truly. We're still telling the story today because of the wisdom that Solomon displayed. The people understood this wasn't just Solomon's wisdom, this was God's wisdom. As we get into our text today, once again, we're going to discover the wisdom of God on display. We're going to be looking at Luke chapter 8, and before we actually get into the text, I want to address the elephant in the room. Most of your Bibles will have a little asterisk or a note that says something to the effect of, the earliest manuscripts do not include chapter 7, 53 through 8:11. And that's true. Some of them don't. If you were to take this passage out of John's Gospel, the message would flow seamlessly right into chapter 8, verse 12. But I'm afraid if we take the passage out, we're going to miss something that John is trying to explain. In John 7, we find Jesus teaching in the temple during the Festival of the Tabernacles, and the crowds and the authorities are becoming increasingly interested in asking and trying to find out who Jesus actually was. But if we get to verse 12 of chapter 8, we get a much darker tone. Jesus accuses the Jews of aggressive disbelief and wanting to kill him because they're following the will of their father, the devil. John 8 contains some of the harshest things Jesus has ever recorded as saying. So how do we get from the Feast of the Tabernacles to Jesus calling the Jews sons of a devil? I think our text this morning sheds some light on the real problem that exists between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders aren't innocent bystanders trying to make sense of this new rabbi. Actually, they're actively opposed to Jesus because they're so steeped in their own understandings and traditions. So whether or not our text originally belonged here, I think it certainly helps us to understand what's going to happen next. Let's look at the text for this morning from John chapter 8. In the morning, he went back to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught out in adultery. They stood her out in the middle. Teacher, they said to him, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses commanded us to stone people like this. What do you say? They said this to test him, so that they could frame a charge against him. Jesus squatted down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they went on pressing the question, he got up and said to them, whichever of you is without sin, he should throw the first stone at her. And once again, he squatted down and wrote on the ground. When they heard that, they went off one by one, beginning with the oldest. Jesus was left alone with the woman still standing there. Jesus looked up. Where are they, woman? Hasn't anyone condemned you? Nobody, sir, she replied. Well, then Jesus said, I don't condemn you either. Off you go. And from now on, don't sin again. Our text begins with people wanting to stone a woman to death, and it ends with them wanting to stone Jesus. And just like the wisdom of God that's displayed through King Solomon, once again we see the wisdom of God revealed through Jesus. We see how Jesus uses the trap that the scribes and the Pharisees had set for him into a trap they're not going to be able to get out of themselves. You know, there was actually another story that took place before this one. It's a story about an anonymous man and a woman, and we don't know their backstory. We don't know why they made the choices that led them into that room where they would be caught in the very act of adultery. But we do know that they're not the only two people that were affected by their decisions. Apparently somebody somewhere heard about a man and a woman who were suspected of having an affair. Their sin presented this promising possibility. They could bring the woman before this popular rabbi, accuse her in public, quote from the law of Moses, and ask Jesus for his verdict. It's a power play. They're looking for a way to discredit Jesus. There's nothing in his character that they could exploit, and I guarantee you they had done some digging through his closets. And if they can't unearth some scandal involving the character of Jesus, perhaps they could generate a scandal with someone else's sin. The plan's simple. If Jesus disagrees with the law and says the woman doesn't deserve to be stoned, then they'll just simply charge him with heresy. They suspected he was soft on sin anyway. But if he agreed with Moses, if he condemned her to death, then he's going to disappoint his followers who are attracted to his compassion and mercy. Plus, there's the possibility that they could tell the Romans, who would be offended that this Jewish rabbi had the gall to act like judge and jury and hand down death sentences. I mean, that's something reserved only for the Roman government. They might even arrest him themselves. So this bit of salacious gossip is welcome news indeed for them. But gossip and suspicion's not enough to make the case against this woman or to make a case out of this woman. Because the same law of Moses required that she be caught in the very act, which means that these religious leaders, these men of God, actually sat around and planned out how they could entrap this woman. They had prior knowledge of the sin that's about to take place, and they are more interested in discrediting Jesus than they were about this woman or her soul. Maybe they made the man an offer he couldn't refuse. Maybe they promised him a clean getaway. Maybe they promised to pay him money for his part in this despicable act. Every part of the plan is disgusting and devoid of human decency. But however it's arranged, the deed is done, the man escaped, the woman is caught, the trap is set. Locating Jesus is going to be easy. Just find the biggest crowd gathered around a rabbi in the temple courts. And when they got there, they just shoved their way through to the center, and there Jesus was, sitting down, teaching the people. They probably dragged this woman into the middle of the circle, and maybe they said something like this, I beg your pardon, Rabbi. I'm so sorry for this interruption, but this is really important. The phrasing of the charges has to be done in such a way that they don't give up their part in this awful plan. They can't say, we went in and caught this woman in the act of adultery. That's going to raise too many questions. Where's the man? Exactly how did you catch her? How did you know? So what they do is they frame the sentence in the passive mood. This woman was caught in the very act of adultery. We're not going to tell you who caught her or when she was caught. You just need to know that somebody, somewhere, at some other time has caught this woman in the middle of her sin and drug her out of that room before she had the chance to cover up and recover some of her dignity. In the law of Moses, we are commanded to stone people like this. So, Jesus, what do you say we do? What is your opinion of what needs to happen? Jesus knew immediately what they were doing. It's a trap, and he's the prey. This woman's the bait. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees stand in the middle of that crowd in a posture of arrogant confidence because they mistakenly believed they had the upper hand. But the woman was also there in the middle of the crowd. She's humiliated, possibly naked, definitely frightened. She probably tried to make herself as small as possible by hugging herself tightly, trying vainly to cover whatever she could and become invisible. Every eye in that crowd was riveted on her, the adulteress, the sinner. Nobody said a word. They didn't have to. Their silent stares communicated their condemnation loudly enough. Death, whether by stoning or shame, would have been a welcome relief to that woman at that moment. But Jesus does something next that has puzzled readers of this story for centuries. He leans down and he begins to write on the ground. And while this woman stands there bare-shouldered and shamed, Jesus is doodling in the dirt. Now, John never tells us what he wrote, and that's captured our imagination for centuries. But I wonder if maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't, what did he write? Maybe the question is, why did he write in the dirt at that moment? I believe firmly that Jesus wrote in the ground because it's a display of the wisdom of God. You see, the people in that crowd did just what you and I have done. For a moment, they forgot all about the woman. They started wondering, what is he doing? What is he writing in the dirt down there? What's he up to? In his wisdom, Jesus wrote in the dirt and drew the spotlight off that woman onto him. He's really good at taking things we can't handle on himself. But the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they're not going to be denied. They believe that they had Jesus on the hook. All they have to do is set the hook and reel him in. So they persist. They keep asking, what do you say? What do you say? What do we do? What do you say? Give us an answer. What do you think that we need to do? Do you want us to follow the law of Moses? Is that what you want us to do? It's at that moment that Jesus stands up and gives them the answer. And not just any answer, the answer, the most famous answer ever given, an answer that is dripping in the wisdom and compassion of our Savior and God. If any one of you doesn't have your own sin, then you should be the first one to throw a stone at her. I imagine at that moment you could have heard a pin drop, or better said, you could have heard a stone drop. Jesus merely stoops back down and starts to write in the dirt again. One by one, these men walk away. The youngest stood around the longest, but even the most stubborn finally figured out what the oldest knew immediately. Jesus has won. Again. This is one of my favorite Jesus stories because it shows us how God deals with sinners, and by extension, how we are supposed to deal with sinners. This is a microcosm of his story. You see, it's all about grace. The woman deserved condemnation. We don't want to ignore her sin. She's guilty. She's caught in the very act. She deserved to be condemned. And when Jesus says, the one without sin should cast the first stone, he's not ignoring her sin or taking away the consequences of her sin. And he's definitely not teaching that we're not supposed to lovingly confront someone who's dying in their sin. What it means is that Jesus recognized that what this woman needed most in her life was grace. She deserved to endure the embarrassment her actions created, but she also needed some dignity. She deserved to face the shaming stares of the crowd all by herself, but she also needed a friend. Jesus gave her what she needed, not what she deserved. And yet she's not the only one who receives grace. In the middle of the temple that morning, the accusers also needed grace. They deserved to be humiliated for their hypocritical exploitation of this woman. But they also needed an opportunity to retreat in dignity. They deserved to receive the punishment that they were trying to bring upon this woman, but they also needed an opportunity to repent. Jesus was as patient with them as he was with her and as he is with us. Truthfully, every one of us deserves to be confronted and condemned. I know we like to think we're the good people, but the truth is, no matter how good we think we are, we're still sinful and deserve hell. But grace means that we get what we need over what we deserve. At the end of the story, Jesus stands with the guilty, and Jesus still stands with the guilty. He wants to give you just what he gave that sinful woman and her sinful accusers. Grace. And since that's how God treats sinners, maybe that's how we should treat them as well. I love the fact that whether they realized it or not, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they did exactly what they should have done. They brought the guilty sinner to Jesus and left her in his hands. I think that's what we're supposed to do. Grace doesn't mean that we're allowed to walk away scot-free. Jesus confronts the sin in the woman's life. Remember, he told her, from now on, don't sin anymore. I think too many people want the grace of God without leaving their lives of sin. They want to end the story of the guilty woman in verse 7. But just because you find a way to feel better about yourself doesn't mean you've experienced the freedom from your sin. If we end the story too soon, we wind up with moral emptiness. If we lack the moral authority to condemn adultery, we don't have the moral jurisdiction to condemn racism or hypocrisy or murder or child abuse. Our culture is barreling towards a bottomless chasm of non-judgmental and ethical helplessness. If we succeed in removing sin from our vocabulary, we inadvertently remove grace as well, because the two concepts are intertwined. They depend on each other. If there's no sin, there can be no grace. Grace is God's response to sin. No sin, no grace. No grace, no hope. As we get ready to make our way to the tables this morning, I want to draw your attention to something that I've missed for years. Personally, I get this large sense of satisfaction as the religious elite are forced to just kind of slink away one by one, defeated, embarrassed, humiliated, and beaten. I really like that part of the story. Jesus wins, the Pharisees lose again. But now when I read this story, I realize that the accusers are not the losers in the story. You see, the Pharisees, they also won because Jesus offers them grace. Jesus allows them the opportunity to confront the sin in their own life and to turn back to God for forgiveness. The real loser in the story is somebody that we never meet, somebody who never makes an appearance. The real loser in the story is the man that was also committing the very act of adultery. You know, he would have been offered grace if he would have come to Jesus. But his refusal to come to the place where forgiveness is found means that he was condemned to remain in the shadows, ashamed, guilty, lost, dead in his own sin. As we go to the tables today, we have to admit that we know his shame, we understand his guilt, because we've also harbored a sinful secret. We know what it's like to live in fear that somebody's going to discover our selfishness, our sinfulness. And we know the truth that the only thing worse than getting caught is not getting caught. But today there's hope, because if the man was only willing to seek out Jesus, he would have had the opportunity to hear Jesus say, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." We go to the tables because we're confessing as we take the bread and the cup that we are sinful people, and what we need is someone to offer us rest and to take the burden of our guilt and to give us grace. And so this morning as we go to the tables, we're going to have some time to think about our relationship with Jesus, and we're going to have some time to think about the struggle of the sin that we commit and what that causes in our life. And my hope and my prayer is that today you're willing to come to the place where you allow Jesus to give you grace. That you're willing to confess the sin that you struggle with, whether it's the sins that you do out for the entire world to see, or the sins you do in the darkness and the shadows you hope no one ever finds out about. That you'll be able to come to the place where you can confess those things to Jesus and allow Him to give you what you most desperately need, His grace. I hope you have a wonderful time around the tables today, and that you never forget how deeply you're loved. I look forward to seeing you next week, but until then, go in peace.